So this video is totally unedited. It is totally unscripted. It's totally off the cuff. So all mistakes, all the errors, you're going to see it all. I just wanted to make this quick video to talk to you about the planning fallacy. This, of course, is one of the decision-making errors that we examined last week in the first section of our course. This is one of the most common cognitive biases that affect us as decision makers. And so I want to go into a little bit more depth and maybe give you an application of this particular problem. So the planning fallacy is a combination of two reinforcing phenomena. So on the one hand, we have the problem of overconfidence. This tendency that we have to overestimate our ability to perform tasks. The tendency to overestimate ourselves as decision makers. This is when pride and ego creeps into our decision making. College professors are notorious for this. 90+% of all college professors surveyed think they are better than the average professor at their institution. That's absolutely ridiculous. But we all have this tendency, right? When I asked you last week to write your essay describing your decision-making style, I had about 35 essays come in, and only 2 students, maybe 3, but clearly in the minority, only just a handful of students described a bad decision, right? A mistake. And I certainly don't fault you for that. I mean, if I'd been in your position, I would have probably done what the majority of the class did. I would have talked about a good decision. But I think that just goes to illustrate that we tend to focus on the good decisions. We tend to think of ourselves generally as good decision makers. So that's part of the problem, overconfidence or overestimating our ability to perform a task. The other issue, the other phenomena that creates the planning fallacy is what I call the problems of life. You know, life just never seems to be as easy as we want it to be or we expect it to be. Jobs and tasks always just seem to be more difficult and take longer than we think they will. Just this morning we had freshman registration. I had some students come in to register for classes. I told my wife, I'll be home in about an hour. Well, 2 hours later I get home because there were all sorts of unexpected problems that came up. One of my students was late getting here, some classes closed, and we had to change schedules around. And so not only was I a bit overconfident, but I also underestimated the problems that might come along as I perform this task. The two of these together generate the planning fallacy. Now, the real issue and the real question for us is how can we deal with the planning fallacy? How can we overcome this decision-making problem? The first thing we have to do is to recognize it and to admit that we have the problem. That's true for any mistake, for any problem in our lives. We have to admit that it's real. The second thing, and I think this is really the key, to overcoming the planning fallacy, we need to introduce margin in our lives. Now, what do I mean by margin? Margin is a self-imposed artificial restriction, a self-imposed artificial limitation. So I do this all the time. Some of you've had me as a ground-based instructor, and you know that my watch and all the clocks in my office at home, they're all set at least 15 minutes fast. Now, why do I do that? Because I don't ever be late. I always want to be on time. I trick myself. I deceive myself into thinking that it's actually 12 o'clock when it's only 11:45. Okay? We can do this in other ways. Maybe you've done this with someone in your life, either a coworker or your husband, your wife, or your children. You need to be somewhere. You really need to be somewhere at 10 o'clock. but you know that this person is always late, so you tell them that they were supposed to be there at 9:30, just to give yourself a little margin, right? So we trick ourselves, we deceive our minds into working ahead of schedule. One way to deal with the planning fallacy. Now, the reason I bring this up, this week you've got a big job ahead of you. You've got an essay to write on a failing business. To complete this task, you have to complete a series of smaller tasks, right? You've got to choose your topic. You've got to choose the firm that you're going to analyze. You've got to do your research. Very often, that is where we underestimate the amount of time and the difficulty that the job will take. Then we have to write the paper. Then we have to clean it up, right? We run it through a spell check, a grammar check, or we have somebody we trust to proofread it. We need to do that always. Well, we have to do all of these things before we get to the final step of submitting the paper. The paper is due midnight on Saturday. You might want to try one of these little mental tricks and just say, okay, I rather than aiming for midnight, I'm going to aim maybe for like 10 o'clock that night. That way I have a bit of a 2-hour margin. And remember Murphy's Law, right? If something can go wrong, it will go wrong, and it almost always goes wrong at the worst possible time, which means right there at the deadline. So, just something to consider, just a few thoughts. All of these decision-making problems are something that we need to realize that maybe we all have a tendency to deal with, and we want to look for ways to overcome those problems. So again, hopefully this not only gives you a little better perspective on the planning fallacy, but it gives you a look at me, at least through the window of this video. Until next time, I'll talk to you later.